the impending Jeddah development, it's asking the question, well, who wants to live sort of a kilometre up in the sky anyway? And it was a little bit surprising, actually, that I hadn't seen any mention amongst all that discussion about the aeronautical impacts of all this proposed development. And I guess it made me reflect on my experience in the last 6 years with AvLaw, and basically summed up why headlines with this were peppered throughout newspapers, particularly in the last couple of years. And it really summed up for me, I guess, the level of understanding that there was amongst the construction industry, at least here, where there's, for a longer time, the council limits in terms of heights were dictating the envelopes to which developers could build. And as you've all probably heard in the last couple of days, the massive investment in infrastructure that's being dedicated towards developing metros and new airports and whatnot has caused, obviously, some priority precincts to be earmarked, and with that comes the intention to build taller and relaxation of these building controls from council's perspective. And I can tell you that it's clear that there is a bit of a gap in the acknowledgement or the understanding of this issue, because we've got calls from developers who will remain unnamed because they may or may not be on the delegate list. But we've got calls from developers when they're 40 floors off the ground before realising that their cranes are going to be penetrating airspace which should otherwise be protected. So that's the context, and that's, I guess, I congratulate, or I thank CTBUH for acknowledging this issue here and allowing us the opportunity to present on this topic. Again, it was more reflection on, I guess, what these sort of interactions with developers, to what extent it was actually understood the impacts of what they were doing. And this sums up some of the actual questions I've been asked in client briefing meetings where, at various stages of the planning process, be it concept or be it at DA, these are the sorts of things which were coming back my direction. So again, it's, I think going forward, based on the conversations that we've been having the last few days and the amount of investment that is going into these infrastructure projects, that clearly we're going to have a lot more to do with each other going forward to, I guess, accommodate one another's interests commercially. So what I'll do is, and this is what I found quite effective when responding back to questions like that, is to bring it back to a context which is more familiar with day-to-day people and people who, I guess, are not directly involved with aviation on a full-time basis. So I'll just pose the question to you guys. Who has been stopped at the airport for carrying this through security? We've got one, okay. So the reason for bringing this up is the basis that whether or not you can build a 100-metre tower on the approach to Sydney Airport or whether or not you can take this on board. It all basically originates from the same place. And so I guess highlighting this as an example that is relatable is, I think, a good way of introducing you guys into acknowledging that aviation law, aviation regulations is affecting you in a different context than every time you go near an airport or near an aircraft. So this is Richard Reed, and some of you may remember that in 2001 he failed in his attempt to detonate a shoe bomb on a flight boarding from Paris to Miami. And this obviously involved, a non-Australian resident, a non-Australian airline flying between two ports which were not in Australia. So why is it that, we're, later on affected by the fact that we're not allowed to take these sort of things on board? And it comes back to the point that aviation as a whole is regulated on an international level. And to understand where that all originates from, we've got to go back to 1944 Ironically, this is a photo taken from the Chicago Convention, which took place on the 7th of December 1944, so the home of the CTBUH as well, quite coincidentally. And basically, this was a meeting amongst, at the time, 52 member states, or 52 nation states, that got together and acknowledged in the aftermath of the Second World War the destructive, I guess, capabilities of aviation, and what it brought about was a realization that to really harness this technology that had come to the fore in a clearly a negative context throughout the world wars, that there was no other way of controlling it unless the very nature of it, I guess, the fact that it was cross-border and it obviously involved a lot of commingling of different nationalities and different nations, that it needed to be harmonized on an international level. And so it's obviously something which had not taken place before in any other context. So as a result of these 52 nation states getting together, the International Civil Aviation Organization was born, and with it essentially created the mechanism that standards and recommended practices which affected everything from what you could take on board to registration of aircraft to accident investigation to airworthiness, and the list goes on. Basically every facet of aviation would essentially be housed and live within this International Civil Aviation Organization and be promulgated to its member states through one of its 19 annexes. So with that, I'll introduce to you what is an Australian term, but nonetheless it exists elsewhere in the world, what we call prescribed airspace, which essentially is the volume of airspace which has been protected surrounding airports that essentially facilitate safe navigation of aircraft in all situations, be it normal procedures and also in situations where there are emergencies and engines are lost and so on and so forth. So the capacity of this airspace is very much determined by the capabilities of communications and navigation and surveillance equipment that are in place. And so as we sort of move away from the traditional sensor-specific navigation that we have, I guess, has been very much the mainstay of aviation since its genesis, and moving more towards performance-based navigation, which uses global navigation systems, or GPS, as we more commonly refer to it. Obviously, this is further developing the extent to which developers and the like can, I guess, utilize that airspace as we progress through its evolution and technology. So I'll just, for the sake of, initially, I guess in the interest of time, but also based on our experience in terms of what particular classifications of this airspace has deemed to be the most that is affected by property development, I'm going to introduce to you a couple terms, one being the obstacle limitation surfaces. This generally is the lowest of these invisible surfaces which you can't see around an airport, but will define that volume of airspace which should be protected from obstacles. And basically what that's established for is to protect a volume of airspace for aircraft and pilots flying by visual reference. So that is any separation from other aircraft or obstacles or terrain is maintained by simply looking out the window and separating in accordance with what they see. Alternatively, there is the procedures for air navigation services, aircraft operations. Some of you, depending on whether you've been involved with any projects that have involved some sort of penetration of this prescribed airspace that I speak of, might be familiar with those acronyms. Basically, what this is a separate level of invisible surfaces that are protecting aircraft flying by instrument flight rules. So that is not separating themselves from obstacles or terrain or other aircraft by looking out the window, but instead relying simply on their instruments. And the third one that I want to just touch on briefly, but I will come back to this later, because I do sort of go through in a little bit more detail a case study, which the application of this particular surface became important, is the radar terrain clearance chart. So basically what this is an internal air traffic control document which assigns the lowest safe altitude that an aircraft can be vectored to in some event which is sort of deviating from standard procedures. So for example, in an emergency situation, it basically assigns a height to which the aircraft can be vectored to, which maintains 1,000 feet of vertical separation from anything within that boundary. So again, we'll come back to that. This is an extract from the Sydney Airport OLS chart. Doesn't really mean much if you're looking at it for the first time, but I'll show it to you from this perspective, and you start to realize that, and this has come up a few times where we're sort of speaking to clients and they say, oh, you know, our building's going through the OLS, and it's almost assumed that it's just one sort of flat line, and clearly it's not. It's a little bit more complex than that. And I guess it's represented by a series of sort of gradients and horizontal planes, as you can see there, and generally extends out for about 15 kilometres from an airport boundary. Now, I think part of the reason why there's a little bit of difficulty in sort of acknowledging these sort of surfaces or these volumes of airspace which should be protected, acknowledging that they exist is simply down to the fact that not all of us have piloted an aircraft before, and you can't see it like the rest of the infrastructure that we can. But the reality is that this does exist, regardless of the fact that you can't see or touch it. And I guess that's part of the reason why this sort of forum is important, is to sort of enter into consciousness the fact that there is other considerations beyond all the other sort of constraints that I mentioned earlier that obviously need to be taken into consideration when you're developing tall buildings. So when it comes to the PANS ops, or those volumes of airspace that I mentioned that are protected for or to facilitate flight via instrument flight rules, the regulations in Australia stipulate that there is to be no permanent penetration of those surfaces. Having said that, there is some cases where a temporary penetration, for example, to allow a crane to assist with completing a development, can be permitted. But the important thing to take from this discussion is that any change, be it for a day or a week or a month, to any of those instrument flight procedures does have a very legitimate economic effect on what are other private entities and airport operators that are in the business of making money. And the way they do that is by making sure that the regularity of their activity, that is taking off and landing at an airport which is privately owned, is maintained. So the way that that can be approached is very important, because ultimately the airlines and the airports are not reaping the benefits directly from tall buildings. So it is important to take that into consideration, that, for example, if there was to be a temporary change to a procedure which resulted in, for example, the takeoff gradient of a certain procedure out of a certain runway to be increased, that may have an effect on the loads, for example, of an aircraft taking off on that runway, to make sure that it's maintaining that minimum clearance of obstacles when it's actually been assigned that procedure. That's not going to affect everyone, but I guess, and I'll touch on this soon, is that it's the lowest common denominator against which is safeguarded. So, you know, for our international travellers, most of you would have flown in on some very modern jet aircraft, A380s, 777s, most likely fitted and decked out with the most up-to-date technology. But the fact is that there is other aircraft and other airspace users that need to be accounted for, and not all of them are capable of performing to the same operational requirements. So that's, again, something worth taking away. That's just another perspective of what, for example, a standard instrument departure or an approach rather would look like if you could see it. So again, I mentioned that it is the multiple uses of an airfield or airspace that need to be factored in when considering the airspace which needs to be safeguarded against. Another way of perhaps thinking about this, and again, I come back to using the toothpaste as an example, maybe in a slightly more familiar context, is assume for a second that the height of this tunnel is to the cars as what the airspace that Qantas 747 is flying in. It's taking consideration of the lowest common denominator against which needs to be factored in that could potentially be using that asset, essentially, to avoid things like this. So hopefully that helps you sort of sink in a little bit. So again, this is sort of a question which does come up is, does it change? What can we do about it? Well, the answer is yes. I mean, we're clearly building taller buildings than we used to. And if you, applied the airspace limits which used to exist retrospectively, you'd see a lot of penetration. So the answer is yes, it does change, but not necessarily very quickly. And I guess these are some of the main catalysts for changes to airspace being taken into effect, or taking effect essentially. It really boils down to changes in infrastructure and technology. But again, as I said, I'll use the example of what's called a ground-based augmentation system, which has been fitted at Sydney Airport for 3 years now. That is capable and has been tested to provide accuracy down to 1 meter in both the vertical and horizontal axis, but there's only a limited number of aircraft that are flying into Sydney Airport that are capable of utilising it. So again, it does take time. So in the absence of these sort of, I guess what you call market forces sort of facilitating taller buildings, the emphasis or the onus relies on the developers to present a case to the aviation regulators and the other stakeholders that there will be no impediment to safety and the regularity of them utilising the asset that they quite rightly have the ability to use and offer to their customers. So this isn't an exhaustive list, but I've just pulled out some of the justifications which have been provided in the past on developments that we've managed on behalf of developers. The first one there is important, and I'll come back to it in the next slide as well, when I sort of go into a little bit more detail on one of the case studies of interest. Utilising prevailing wind conditions is another example of perhaps facilitating sort of short-term lifts in cranes, for example. As you would know, the use of runways and the way in which aircraft are navigated generally out of an airport depends very much on the weather and the direction of the wind. So in some instances where prevailing wind conditions would obviously negate the need or remove the option of utilising a particular runway in a certain direction, if there's procedures that are not going to be used for a period of time, there is those windows of opportunity to take advantage of, so to speak. In Sydney, we've got some artificial constraints, let's say, one of them being a curfew, so a very limited number of aircraft operate out of Sydney Airport between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. every night. It's limited to a small number of freight operations. There are no passenger carrying operations during those hours. So again, this could potentially provide an opportunity for, again, more temporary penetrations like I've explained with the cranes given earlier. So this then brings me to the case study that I've tried to condense down to the next 4.5 minutes by the looks of it. Basically, we took carriage of this development application after the developer had already pursued an approval from the Aviation Authorities without the support of an aeronautical impact assessment. And what they were told was to reduce the height of their building quite significantly. So this is when we were invited to sort of hold their hand through that process. And I guess the the quick and dirty of it is, yes, there was a penetration of the OLS, or the obstacle limitation surfaces, but there were existing taller structures in proximity to this proposed development, so that wasn't seen as an issue. The PANS-OPS surface at that site was was higher than what the development was proposing, both in a permanent sense with the building envelope as well as the cranes, so that wasn't an issue. The issue came down to the interpretation, let's say, of that radar terrain clearance chart, which I mentioned briefly earlier. So just to recap, that is a chart used by air traffic controllers to essentially vector aircraft to a lowest assignable altitude whilst maintaining 1,000 foot of separation from the closest obstacle. And what we found was the reason why Air Services Australia, who are for those international visitors or anyone local that doesn't know, they provide air traffic control navigation services in Australia. They were strictly applying the lower RTCC sector boundary height across the entire site, despite the fact that it was cutting more or less straight through it. So therein lies the onus on the developer to essentially justify why applying the higher RTCC sector boundary across the whole site would not have an impediment to safety. So that works out to be about an 80-metre difference. So we look at it basically and we say, well, what would we like it to look like? And well, it would be great if that line was just 80 metres to the right. So this is just an extract from that RTCC chart. If you focus on those sort of bolded black lines, that's where the boundaries are drawn. And there are a couple heights there which you can see. In this instance, they're both the same. So you've got the 800 metres, so 800 feet, that is, sorry, there in the top left corner, the same one. Essentially what that tells you is that in that area, within that sector, the lowest assignable altitude would be 1,000 foot on top of what that height says. So that's basically what it's all about. So there again, I'll just highlight the fact that the western side of the site was falling within the higher boundary, and basically when we considered this from a safety perspective, we looked at the likelihood of that lower sector height actually technically or from an operational sense being assigned to a aircraft that in this instance would be over the CBD, and it seemed quite unlikely that, for example, in an emergency scenario when an aircraft has lost an engine or some other incident has taken place, that an air traffic controller would be asking that pilot to fly over a very populated CBD. So basically, with the help of our advice, that managed to gather support from the Civil Aviation Safety Authority and Air Services, who had initially rejected the application so far as advising the developer to reduce it down to the low height. So I'll just finish by just sort of summing up the context a little bit more. In 2010, the Department of Infrastructure and Regional Development received 70 applications for building height or crane approvals. Last year, that was 300. And I think the important thing to take away from all this is to not ignore the fact that this discussion about collaboration and everything that we've been hearing, which is fantastic the last couple of days, should very well include the impact of the aviation stakeholders that it sounds like you'll have a lot more to do with going forward. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.